The 1970s marked the decade when animation broke out of its cage. Filmmakers no longer drew for children, they drew to challenge, provoke, and scandalize. These weren't Saturday morning cartoons. They were weapons of rebellion. From political fury to graphic surrealism, every frame carried risk. Some were banned, others destroyed, but all changed animation forever. At number 10 is Wizards, Ralph Bakshi's strange fusion of magic, politics, and post-apocalyptic ruin. Produced under 20th Century Fox for $1.2 million, Bakshi envisioned a fantasy epic that used animation to dissect ideology itself. The world he built was divided between mutants resurrecting old technology and elves preserving the remnants of peace. What startled audiences was his use of real Nazi propaganda footage within animated battle scenes. Tanks rolled through scorched landscapes under banners of swastikas, a decision that 20th Century Fox executives demanded he remove. Bakshi refused. Promotion was cut, advertising minimized, and the film was quietly released to a handful of theaters. European distributors censored large sections showing propaganda montages, and several U.S. theaters declined to screen it at all. Critics didn't know what to make of it. Half fairy tale, half historical nightmare. Yet word spread quickly through underground audiences. Wizards grew into a cult event, playing midnight screenings for years. Behind its strange creatures and glowing swords lay a study of propaganda's power, delivered through the very medium once dismissed as harmless entertainment. At number 9 is The 9 Lives of Fritz the Cat, a sequel that pushed underground animation to self-destruction. Directed by Robert Taylor and produced on a budget of $750,000, it continued Fritz's journey without Robert Crumb's blessing. The film threw its feline anti-hero into a collage of surreal fantasies, war zones, dictatorships, and drug trips, each bursting with graphic violence and sexual chaos. The MPAA gave it an X rating on release, making distribution nearly impossible. Australia banned it entirely, while UK and Italian versions were heavily edited to remove explicit scenes. Critics reacted with exhaustion. The New York Times called it a cartoon meltdown, capturing how far the counterculture experiment had spiraled. The sequel failed to recapture Bakshi's edge or Crumb's satire, instead becoming the symbol of an adult animation boom gone too far. Yet it remains part of cinema history for testing how much the medium could endure before collapsing under its own weight. Number 8 belongs to Tarzoon, Shame of the Jungle, the film that proved European animators could outshock Hollywood. Directed by Picha and Boris Schulzinger, this French-Belgian production cost roughly $500,000 and featured an English dub with John Belushi and Bill Murray. Its premise twisted the Tarzan myth into absurdity, Tarzoon battling armies of mutant sperm soldiers and grotesque jungle villains in explicit scenes that stunned audiences. The estate of Edgar Rice Burroughs sued immediately for defamation, forcing a global title change and delaying distribution. In New Zealand, censors banned it outright. The UK and several US states demanded cuts to remove sequences labeled obscene. Women's groups in New York picketed outside screenings, calling for a total ban. Critics dismissed it as juvenile pornography, but the scandal turned it into a cult success. By the early 1980s, bootleg VHS copies circulated across college campuses, transforming Tarzoon into a symbol of how far animation could stretch satire before society snapped. Number 7 is Belladonna of Sadness, a film so haunting that Japan buried it for decades. Directed by Eiichi Yamamoto and produced by Osamu Tezuka's Mushi Productions, it was inspired by Jules Michelet's 19th century witchcraft text La Sorcière. The film followed Jeanne, a young woman assaulted by a nobleman who turns to a demonic entity for vengeance, her transformation rendered through sprawling watercolor paintings and psychedelic imagery. Its combination of sexual violence, surrealism, and religious symbolism drew the wrath of Japanese censors, who banned it from mainstream theaters in 1973. France limited screenings to adult audiences only. The film's failure bankrupted Mushi Productions, effectively ending one of Japan's pioneering animation studios. For decades, Belladonna existed only in fragments and rumor until a full restoration in 2016 reignited global fascination. Today, scholars call it a visionary feminist masterpiece and one of the most daring works in anime history, an artwork that turned taboo into poetry. At number 6 stands Allegro non troppo, Italy's most ambitious act of animated rebellion. Directed by Bruno Bozzetto and produced in Milan for $600,000, it reimagined Fantasia as a dark, adult satire that mocked modern life, religion, and consumerism. Bozzetto combined live-action comedy skits with animated segments scored to classical works by Ravel, Sibelius, and Vivaldi. The results were breathtaking and blasphemous in equal measure. The Vatican condemned the film for mocking divine creation. Disney's legal team attempted to suppress its international screenings, citing plagiarism of Fantasia's concept. The controversy elevated its status overnight. It premiered at the Cannes Film Festival to packed audiences, where critics hailed its creativity and visual intelligence. Italy's film board briefly considered cutting several sequences depicting Adam and Eve as corporate mascots before relenting. Over the years, Allegro non troppo became a cornerstone of European animation, studied for its technical precision and its fearless satire of Western culture's sacred icons. Hit subscribe before we enter the top 5. The next films triggered bans, raids, and outrage powerful enough to redefine what animated cinema could dare to show. Number 5 takes us to Coonskin, Ralph Bakshi's boldest and most explosive work. Released in 1975 by Paramount Pictures, the film fused live action and animation with a modest $1 million budget. Bakshi's goal was to depict the realities of urban America through 3 black characters navigating Harlem's violence, corruption, and exploitation. His satire hit a nerve. Before the film even reached theaters, the Congress of Racial Equality launched protests outside Los Angeles and New York screenings, accusing it of perpetuating stereotypes. Many demonstrators never saw the film. The title alone ignited outrage. Paramount pulled the movie after its first weekend as theaters faced threats and vandalism. Atlanta, Detroit, and several other U.S. cities issued temporary bans citing racial unrest. Critics were sharply divided, some calling it vulgar provocation, others labeling it political genius. Variety described it as politically explosive, and decades later, Quentin Tarantino would praise it as one of Bakshi's most fearless works. Rediscovered in the 1990s, Coonskin became a case study in how animation could confront America's racial divide head-on, cementing its legacy as a landmark in both controversy and artistic courage. Number 4 is Heavy Traffic, Ralph Bakshi's rawest and most personal film. Produced for $400,000 by Steve Krantz, it blended live action and animation to create a portrait of New York in decay. The story follows Michael, a young animator whose chaotic life mirrors the world around him. Gangs, hustlers, broken families, and fleeting dreams of escape. Bakshi drew from his own Bronx upbringing, showing the city as a living organism made of vice and survival. The MPAA branded it with an X rating, and its unfiltered view of urban poverty drew bans in South Africa, partial restrictions in Italy, and censorship from multiple U.S. distributors. The Village Voice named it the taxi driver of animation, praising its realism and courage. Martin Scorsese cited it as an influence, noting its ability to turn cartoon form into documentary emotion. Heavy Traffic made $1.5 million at the box office, a strong return for its size, but its legacy runs deeper. It opened the path for adult animation that spoke the language of real life instead of fantasy. Bakshi called it the film that bled me dry, a line that perfectly fits the brutal honesty it delivered. At number 3 comes Italy's forbidden fairy tale, Il Nano e la Strega, The Dwarf and the Witch. Directed by Giba and produced by Minerva Film, it carried a modest budget and a reputation that far outweighed its reach. The story centers on a cursed dwarf prince ensnared in the spells and desires of a witch who offers him power through sin. The art style was primitive but bold, filled with crude line work and surreal erotic imagery. Italian prosecutors seized the reels before release, cutting nearly 40 meters of explicit content before the film could even reach theaters. Several provinces banned it outright, citing obscenity laws meant for live-action adult films. When it finally premiered in Rome under the rebranded title Zizi Pan Pan, audiences were divided between laughter and shock. It failed commercially, but quickly became a collector's item, its existence whispered about in European animation circles. For historians, Il Nano e la Strega remains a symbol of Italy's struggle between expression and morality, proof that even hand-drawn fantasy could provoke courtroom trials and police raids. Number 2 lands on Down and Dirty Duck, Roger Corman's most infamous misfire that accidentally became a cult landmark. Directed by Charles Swenson and made for $350,000 under Corman's New World Pictures, the film followed an insurance clerk who spirals into debauchery under the guidance of a talking duck. What sounds comedic became one of the most explicit animated features of its time, packed with racial caricatures, surreal sexuality, and stream-of-consciousness chaos. The MPAA considered rating it beyond X, but settled on that mark reluctantly. Chicago and Boston banned it immediately. Several U.S. theaters terminated screenings mid-show after local complaints, while TV stations refused to carry its advertisements. Critics recoiled. Variety called it animation that makes Bakshi look tame. Roger Corman himself withdrew his name, calling it too far even for New World. Yet underground audiences embraced it. Bootleg copies spread through college towns and comic conventions, elevating Down and Dirty Duck into the mythology of banned media. What began as exploitation became cultural rebellion, proof that 1970s animation had no ceiling for obscenity, only the limits set by who dared to watch. Number 1 belongs to Watership Down, a film that proved horror could hide inside innocence. Directed by Martin Rosen and based on Richard Adams' best-selling novel, it was financed independently for $2.4 million. On the surface, it told the story of rabbits fleeing the destruction of their home, animated in soft, natural tones that promised a gentle adventure. What followed shocked an entire generation. The violence was immediate and unrelenting. Rabbits suffocated, torn apart, and hunted with a realism rarely seen in animation. The British Board of Film Classification rated it U, meaning suitable for all ages, a decision that led to public outrage. Parents walked out of screenings with crying children. Complaints flooded the BBC when the movie later aired on television. Germany and Sweden cut multiple scenes depicting animal deaths, calling them psychologically harmful. Despite this, Watership Down earned over $4 million worldwide and received the Saturn Award for Best Animated Film. Critics described it as a masterpiece of emotional storytelling. Decades later, it remains the film that redefined what animation could portray: death, fear, and the raw struggle for survival. These 5 films stand as the height of 1970s animation's rebellion. Each one clashed with laws, institutions, or morality itself. They were banned for violence, suppressed for sexuality, or silenced for politics. Yet their survival shaped the next generation of storytellers who saw animation not as escape, but as confrontation. What they created was not just controversy, it was evolution. Their survival shaped the next generation of storytellers who saw animation not as escape, but as confrontation. What they created was not just controversy, it was evolution.